Hi friends, welcome to the third week of our class, Introduction to Comparative Politics. In this week, we will be trying to examine a very important ideology of contemporary times, that is nationalism. And we will examine the historical roots of nationalism over the theories of Benedict Anderson and Ernest Gellner. These scholars provided the most prominent and agreed explanations of the roots of nationalism. So we will be covering them in this week. So in this very first video, I will be talking about the basic tenets of Benedict Anderson's account. And in the second video, I will be talking about Ernest Gellner's account, okay? So for this first one, these questions that you see on the screen will guide my brief lecture. And you also see a link here to a YouTube video, short YouTube video, like briefly summarizing the basic assumptions and points of Gellner, Anderson, and other important tenets in the nationalism literature. Okay, so Benedict Anderson. Actually, Benedict Anderson, which is he's a very prominent scholar. He writes his book, Imagined Communities, to challenge a important trend in nationalism literature of the time, which is called as primordialist school. So this school of thought argues that nations are immutable, ineffable, and unchanging natural facts, which kept its essence from the time immemorial. So according to these scholars, national identity are based on kinship or blood ties, and they are natural phenomena. However, like Benedict Anderson, Ernest Gellner, and other scholars who are framed as modernist school or social constructivists, they actually argue that nationalism and the attached concepts like national identity, nationness, or nations, they are all modern artifacts which emerge as a result of some political, economic, social, and cultural transformations arising out of modernization. So, Benedict Anderson provides a cultural explanation or culturalist explanation of the emergence of nationalism. So he says that like nationalism, nationness, national identity, or nations are modern cultural artifacts. Despite their like artificiality and modernity though, these phenomena command a great degree of emotional legitimacy. To the extent that like people sacrifice their life for their nation. So we need to understand when, where, and how these modern artifacts came to being. So, like Benedict Anderson starts his analysis with an important observation. He says that, like the dawn of nationalism or its emergence, coincided with the decline or dusk of religion, especially in the times of enlightenment. So religions, like organized religions, actually they allow their followers to make sense of their world or to give meaning to their everyday experience and sufferings. Although these sufferings persist, the religion has lost its capacity to give meaning and lost its credibility in the times of enlightenment. And nationalism has, although unself-consciously and undeliberately, emerged or became a dominant framework at the time to fill this vacuum. So what is nation? Benedict Anderson, in his very famous definition, defines nation as an imagined community, which is defined inherently as limited and so on. So there are four important constituent elements of this definition, and we need to go over them one by one. So emergence. So, like in today's United States, there are around 340 million of people who are the members of American nation. Although you, or most of you, are more likely to define or associate yourself with this national identity or define yourself as a member of American nation, it is impossible for you to, let's say, turn this definition or self-definition into an experiential reality, which meant that you cannot meet or see or hear or first-handedly interact with most members of the American nation. Right? It's impossible. Nevertheless, you still deem yourself as equal and as brothers of the people that you don't know in your everyday life. So the attachment to American nation actually requires a mental effort, requires an imagination of your simultaneous membership to an overall community. So it is imagined in that respect. It is not first-handedly experienced. Second, community. Although, let's say, like the inequalities or the discriminations are abound in every nation today, actually, like it is the the basic assumption of the nation actually relies on the idea of horizontal solidarity and like over like principle. So the members of American nation see each other as equal members of this broader collectivity and this bounded collectivity. Okay, so the third one, limited or boundedness. So unlike religions which have universal ambitions such as to dream of a world where everyone is Christian or Muslim, actually nations don't have universal ambitions or programs. Even the most messianic or even the broadest or most crowded nations in the world, such as Chinese nation of 1.4 billion people, they don't claim or they don't dream of a world which is only preoccupied by Chinese nation. The nations are built on the idea of unassimilable distinctiveness, and they don't claim to represent the whole humanity. So it is limited in that respect. So the boundary between American nation and the Mexican nation, or the Chinese nation, or the British nation, or however you want, or the German nation, which nation you want to say, they are all clear, assumed to be unassimilable, and distinct from each other. And the third and the last one is sovereign. Actually, the emergence of nationalism changed the basic source of justification. So before, the divinely ordained hierarchical dynastical orders are, or they made up the most important and pervasive source of legitimacy of political rule. However, these dynastical orders declined, lost their political powers, and nations or national states, or sorry, nation states or nations emerge, like with the dream or with the object of being embodied in sovereign states which don't depend on any transcendental or any hierarchical ordinance. Okay, so it's sovereign in that respect. So the emergence of nationalism or nations or national identity as modern artifacts actually requires the constellation of distilled historical forces that I will be discussing right now. The first issue to take into account is like nationalism as a cultural framework or as a mental mindset actually replaced a few other alternative culture artifacts. These are religious communities, dynastical, hierarchical dynastic orders, and certain assumptions of temporality. So the first one, like these religious communities, actually they build on the idea of sacredness of this community, like their monopoly of knowledge and reality and superiority, which is communicated and could only be apprehended through a one single sacred language. It is, let's say, Latin for Christians, or Arabic for Muslims, or Mandarin for Chinese civilizations, or their religious communities. Okay. However, like this sense of like monopoly of access to the objective truth or ontological reality through the sacred language has actually shattered. First, as a result of the geographical explorations, and second, the decline of Latin language in Europe. So Europeans discovered or explored new territories, and they encountered with like arcane civilizations or groups of people who even don't have any idea of what Christianity is or meant. So just remember the debate between Sepulveda and De las Casas that we discussed in the very first. So the encounter with these totally different people actually shattered the idea of centrality and universality of these religious communities, like Christian religious community. And the dethronement of Latin emerged as a result of some developments that I will discuss later on. So the second point here, though, like the decline of dynastic role, again as I discussed a few minutes ago, became a very important one, especially after the emergence of modern states. So these hierarchical, like dynastical orders, which were built on the idea of distinctiveness between the ruler and the ruled. So ruler is assumed to be divinely ordained or assigned by the gods as the shadow of the god on earth, and the ruled make up of like distinct and heterogeneous group of people, like different from each other, was the most important and most efficient way of organizing power. Like we are talking about these huge dynastical empires. However, they lost their importance, especially for the reason that we discussed last week. Okay? So, the decline of these dynastical political orders was also another important thing to take into account here. So, these were the cultural rival frameworks whose decline or the decline of which led to the emergence or facilitated the emergence of nationalism as a dominant cultural mentality. The third important cultural transformation is about our assumptions and understanding of temporality or the time. So the medieval Christian mind or humanity actually perceive time as a circular, as a cyclical phenomenon. So the conception of history as an endless chain of cause and effect, or radical separation between the present and the past, was not there in their imagination or understanding of time at that time. So if you ever look at the paintings of, let's say, some Christian like figures like Virgin Mary or Christ in the say 14th century or 13th century or even 15th century paintings, they were portrayed as like like modern day like people of Italy, like in their physical appearance, like in their costumes. So they didn't have a conception of the past with its own distinctive, let's say, features like costumes or habits or experiences. Okay, and this is an important issue as well because the naive, like linear, like progressively flowing assumptions of time or temporality actually is built on the idea of simultaneity or temporal coincidence. Just assume or imagine that you are reading newspapers like daily newspapers or novels. So while reading these newspapers, you are, let's say, inherently aware of the simultaneity of this means of communication, right? Like if you are reading this newspaper, then there should be millions of other people who are reading this newspaper at the same time with you. So you will see the specific date on the newspaper, like 27th of May 2020, and there will be, and everyone like reading this newspaper at the same time is just sharing this temporal domain. And tomorrow there will come another newspaper. So the sense of simultaneity is inherent or embedded in this reading experience. Also, like by reading these newspapers or the novels, you are actually receiving constant messages about the presence of people or occurrence of events in other parts of your country, which is again an important phenomenon because like these news are produced for you and for a group of people to whom these news are important or who are interested in these news. So like when you read anything about what's happening in California, you inherently assume that like who live in Turkey doesn't have anything to do with this the occurrence or the people in California. Again, like the simultaneity and the boundedness of this reading experience again are important parts of the cultural dimension of nationalism. So, in terms of historical forces, actually Benedict Anderson provides two group of or explicates on two groups of factor here, which are negative and positive occurrence or transformations. The negative ones are actually about the dethronement of Latin, and the positive ones are about the formative impact of print capitalism. So, for the Latin, so the Latin language actually became esoterized or disconnected, detached from the ecclesiastical and daily language of the time, especially after Renaissance, right? Because like the humanists of the time, actually they discovered the texts like harking back to pre-Christian periods. So they revived the antique traditions and they emulated the artistic language and sort of jargon language in these texts. So the Latin language became more and more esoterized, detached from its like religious or everyday usage. It's an important one for the declining importance of Latin language. Secondly, Reformation became another and possibly a more important factor here because like the Martin Luther, he like by breaking the monopoly of papacy or Catholic Church in disseminating the religious knowledge, actually published his own biblical translation in German language of his territory. And it became a bestseller one. Like at the time, like between 1510s and 1530s. So the Reformation actually meant, together with the, let's say, opportunities provided by the print capitalism, meant the publication of Bible and all other religious and non-religious texts in so-called vernacular languages or non-Latin languages. And the third one is administrative vernaculars. again, the ambitious would be dynasties of the time in 16th century and 17th century. They started to use vernacular language, like some dialects of German or English or French, as administrative communicative tools by replacing the Latin language. So all of these three developments actually were the necessary negative forces. Negative in the sense that they meant or they led to the declining significance of Latin language at the time. However, there was also required some positive forces. And these forces are the interaction between like print technology, the invention of print machines as a new tool of communication, its interaction with a certain or with a like specific mode of economic reproduction, capitalism. So the combination of them, print capitalism. And the third one is fatality of human linguistic diversity, which meant that certain dialectics could easily be eliminated or they could easily disappear as a result of centralization or standardization. So briefly talk about the interaction between these three. So like the print machine owners or the print capitalists of the time in 16th century, actually until the midst of 17th century, they again published their works in the lingua franca of the time, the Latin language. Like the pan-European higher intelligentsia was speaking this language, and this was the basic mode of communication between them in their intellectual works. So as the most literate and as the group of people who were more prone to buy these newly printed books, these print capitalists published the text in this Latin language. Okay. However, this market was not very huge, and it easily saturated. So the print capitalists, they actually started to search for new markets to sell their books, to reproduce their economic operations. And they started to publish in vernacular languages, like the different dialects prevalent in, let's say, certain localities of Europe. However, like they could do or they could publish these works in these local dialects, which provide like very small markets, again, which could be easily saturated again, and thus which wouldn't provide lots of economic profits. So the Latin market is saturated, and these local vernaculars, they are not big enough or they are not lucrative enough. So, like by publishing in these, like what is known as print languages, they actually found a most optimum market here, below Latin language, which is already saturated, and upper or broader than the local vernaculars. These vernaculars, actually the certain vernaculars, or these print languages, uh, were very important for the development of the idea of nationalism and nations. At least for a few reasons. First, these languages actually, like print languages, they provided a certain sense of fellow readers. So within this context, like within German-speaking readers, or French-speaking readers, or English-speaking readers of the time. Okay, so these readers were aware of that they are making up a distinct group of people here. Like French-speaking readers are different from, importantly different from, like English-speaking readers. Okay, so this sense of limitedness or distinctiveness is important here, is achieved here. And secondly, so like these print languages or these print printing operations actually gave a certain fixity to these languages, right? Because like the nationalism, or in its popular mundane experience, they still our built on the idea of antiquity of nations and or fixity of national elements like national identity or national language or national culture, blah blah blah. So these print technologies or print languages like gave this necessary fixity to these languages and to these national communities. So when you read a text published in, let's say, 17th century English, you can understand this language more or less because this language has been made more or less, not fully, not completely, fixated, which wouldn't be achieved if the standardization of publication and these languages wouldn't take place. So, or if the language is allowed to evolve, like naturally. So this is an important element. And the third one, actually, like these print languages lead to the languages of power, which meant that, like in the process, certain dialects or certain vernaculars became became more important than their alternatives in a certain territory. So, for example, in Germany, northwestern part or the language or the vernacular spoken in the northern western part of Germany was selected as the official of German language at the time, and it and the others were like eliminated or suppressed, or they had to disappear. Again, first, because they were no longer the intellectual languages through which new books are published in print capitalism, and secondly, these singularly selected dialects, like Northwestern German dialectic at the time, they were declared as the official language of the territory and became the instructional language of the education in that territory. So it's like the all educational operations or all state operations, all bureaucratic operations, all official operations were conducted in this singularly selected Northwestern dialect of the time, which meant like gradual disappearance or elimination of other dialects of the time. So I know this is a very complex like constellation of events which might be hard to consume or comprehend, but I try to simplify the account developed by Benedict Anderson here. So again, he sees nationalism as a new, as a modern, as a cultural mental map which we use to make sense of our world and make sense of our experience, and through which we connect like fraternity or the achieve bond between us and the power, between us power and the time. Okay, so these are important elements of the complicated explanation of Benedict Anderson. So thanks so much for listening. In the next video, I will be talking about much more simpler explanation of Ernest Gellner. Have a great day.